Okay, good morning, everyone. I can see that we have about 24 participants, so I'm going to ask our colleague to start this webinar recording. And I can see the recording is on. Welcome this morning to the PSEAH training that we've put together for you. Thank you for joining us. It's a very important piece of policy that has been introduced by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. As we move into the presentation, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to refer to my colleagues. Harshini, can you tell me, can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's visible now.
Excellent. Okay. So my name is Wendy Martinek, and I'm the Director of International Partnerships and Services at Trobe International. And you are joining a webinar today to learn more about DFAT's Preventing Sexual Exploitation and Abuse and Harassment policy that was introduced in 2019. Today's webinar, we have the audio setting. You are automatically muted on this session, and we are recording the session. We will be having a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. And so to submit questions, could you please use the Q&A link, and we will respond to these questions at the end of the session in a live format. Please do not use the chat function because we will only be monitoring the Q&A button for this webinar. There are a series of reference materials that are available, and they are listed on this screen as the DFAT PSEAH policy, the DFAT guidance on assessing risk of PSEAH, La Trobe's sexual harm prevention and response procedure for DFAT funded programs and activities, and links to the LTI, the La Trobe International intranet. At the close of this presentation, if those who have attended will receive the presentation via email, and this presentation will also be made available on the La Trobe International intranet. So the session agenda today will cover a number of topics. I will present an overview of DFAT PSEAH policy, and then I will hand over to my colleague Harshini Igoroff, who is the manager of La Trobe Abroad, and she will be responsible for presenting on La Trobe's responsibilities under the PSEAH policy. Harshini will then hand on to Tim Bendel, who is the senior coordinator for La Trobe Abroad, facilitating offshore study programs. And then we will move into a quick example of some case studies that our colleagues in the risk office have assisted us in putting together. And then we will move into Q&A. Our Q&A will be run by our manager of international relations, and that will be run by Sirat Chankamnarkarn. I'm highlighting a number of staff in this webinar today to reassure participants that there are a number of people in the university that can assist you at any time with questions that you may have about this very important policy. So let's get started. The overview of DFAT PSEAH policy. So in April 2019, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade did introduce the Preventing Sexual Exploitation, Abuse and Harassment policy. They gave partners 12 months from the date of effect, and we'll go through this a little bit later because there were multiple dates of effect to become compliant with the policy. The PSEAH policy sets out expectations and requirements for all DFAT staff and delivery partners, of which La Trobe University is one, to manage sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment risks and incidents. This policy applies to all DFAT staff and all DFAT partners in Australia and overseas. So who does this policy apply to? You can see on the screen there are a number of circles that represent stakeholders that will be engaged with DFAT programming. And you can see the orange bubble that's listed there as DFAT partners. La Trobe University is a DFAT partner, and this includes our downstream partners for DFAT funded programs. So to give you a quick overview, The majority of DFAT-funded programs that La Trobe University works with are facilitated by La Trobe International, and they fall into two major categories. The first is the Australia Awards Program, which Sirarat Chankendra facilitates for the university and deals with completely sponsored students by the Australian government to come and study with us for a full degree. The second grouping relates to the new Colombo Plan program, which is student mobility funding and is facilitated by our La Trobe Abroad team, which is managed by Harshini Igoroff. We are aware that there are many opportunities through DFAT to secure funding and work in partnership with them, and that there may be research projects or other academic projects that our university community is engaging with. But for the purposes of this policy and execution of the procedure, La Trobe International will be the main contact for facilitating compliance for this policy. So the important thing for everyone to understand here is, if you are engaging in any sort of DFAT-funded program and you have not been in contact with La Trobe International, you need to make contact as soon as possible so we can assist you with ensuring compliance in your activity. The PSEAH policies and principles, there are 6 of them, and I'll quickly go through them today. They're on the screen. Principle 1, zero tolerance of inaction. Principle 2, strong leadership accelerates cultural change. Principle 3, victim survivor needs are prioritized. Principle 4, PSEAH is a shared responsibility. Principle 5, gender inequality and other power imbalances are addressed. And principle 6, strong reporting will enhance accountability and transparency. As a part of the policy that the government has distributed to Australia, there are a series of minimum standards that the university will need to meet as a partner. And I'll quickly go through just the standards, and then we will talk through how La Trobe University will be ensuring compliance to these standards moving forward. The first minimum standard is to have a PSEAH policy or other documented policies and procedures in place and clearly communicate expectations of this policy. Standard 2 is have reporting and investigation procedures in place. Standard 3 is have risk management processes that include the risk of PSEAH. Standard 4 is to have effective PSEAH training in place. And this training today is one example. Standard 5, recruitment and screening processes and employment practices that address and manage the risk of PSEAH. Standard 6, we need to prohibit transactional sex for all personnel while engaged in the direct delivery of DFAT business, and that aligns with university procedure and protocol. And Standard 7, prohibit fraternization for all non-national personnel while engaged in the direct delivery of the DFAT business. So I will now hand over to Harshini Igoroff, the manager of La Trobe Abroad, to present the next session.
Thank you, Wendy. So I'm going to quickly talk you through the actual procedure that we've outlined in this effort. And this policy underpins a number of La Trobe University's existing policies, as well as the DFAT, PSEAH and Child protection policies. So moving on to the next slide. Thank you, Wendy. La Trobe's DFAT funded programs and activities and management and reporting procedure outlines the 4 key areas: the risk management, assessment and management, applying appropriate minimum standards that Wendy has just highlighted to you, and monitoring our downstream partners. When we talk about downstream partners, it could be any partners that we work with in another country in running the program or facilitating the program. Anyone who's involved in the program are considered our downstream partners. Report concerns. There are several reporting guidelines in terms of reporting incidents and concerns to the DFAT Secretariat, as well as reporting outline and outcomes within the La Trobe University. Moving on to the scope of the procedure. This procedure applies to all parties that are involved in the DFAT funded programs or activities during the time of the program. That includes La Trobe staff, La Trobe students, all our downstream partners, direct partners, and anyone involved in the facilitation of any component of the program. And any programs that are onshore, offshore, online, or in person are in the scope of the procedure. Onshore programs, mostly offshore programs would be the new Colombo plan funded programs that we manage in the La Trobe Abroad team. And some of the onshore programs may comprise of the international students programs that are coming through to La Trobe, like the Australia Awards program. But we've also identified that there are a number of other research-based funded programs, etc., that are DFAT funded that run within the university. And in recent times, we've had most of our programs moved on to an online setup. And so it still continues to apply for the online programs as well. And the duration of the programs in terms of when does it apply? It applies both during normal working hours when you're engaged in the program, or when you are engaged in the program outside of normal working hours. So for an example, if you are a program lead that is doing an offshore program, and you'll have your learning outcomes, learning time, or the actual program interaction time within normal working hours. However, outside of those hours, if you are leading a group of students and yourself, and you're engaging with the local communities and local partners, that will still comprise of the full program. So from the start and to the end of the program, you'll be considered anytime you're engaging with the parties in that funded program premise. You will be considered to be under the, to be required to be in scope of complying with the DFAT funded program policies. So as I mentioned before, there are a number of policies and procedures already intact within La Trobe University. And we are underpinning a lot of these policies. When we developed the procedure, we had to underpin the scope of these procedures and policies. And it was important because we, as a university, we already have some really robust policies in place. And these policies, main ones are the sexual harm prevention response policy, the staff recruitment policy, privacy of personal information policy, records and archives management policy. You can access these policies from the La Trobe policy library, and there's a link on there. The second set of policies, obviously, is the DFAT policies, DFAT Prevention of Sexual Exploitation, Abuse and Harassment policy, as well as the DFAT Child Protection policy. DFAT Child Protection policy comes into play under the PSEAH policy, which DFAT has put forward. So it was important for us to embed the child protection policy as well as we move forward on ensuring compliance with the PSEAH DFAT requirements. So it would be good if you are able to have a look through these policies if you are not familiar with them. And again, when we send you the presentation, you'll have all the links to it. So the procedure underpins 6 main parts. And they guide you through a number of different aspects of what we have tried to implement or embed in relation to what DFAT requires us to ensure compliance with. Part A, the first part, talks about risk assessment and due diligence for managing risk of PSEAH. And down the track, we will have a separate conversation about it. So my colleague Tim Bendel will eventually present to you what that tool looks like. This tool was developed for implementation in discussion with our risk management team at La Trobe University, and they have had a big input in this tool as we implemented it. Moving on to part B, training and induction. Staff training and induction, generally human resources induction at the commencement of the employment of the university is a key part being employed at La Trobe. So that is a mandatory requirement, and staff need to be familiar with that induction components where they discuss all the, staff conduct policies, etc. And then obviously there's a second part to the staff training, which is a DFAT funded program induction training. We already have a induction training module in a PowerPoint form, which is available on our intranet. And down the track, we are also looking to develop a more formal module to address this matter. But this particular instance that we are now presenting on also forms part of that induction. So moving on to students who are at La Trobe are already required to complete a module on the university's learning management system called Consent Matters. And this is a mandatory requirement for being a university student, but we also have underpinned that requirement in this procedure. In addition to the above, we also have students who get nominated for a new Colombo Plan program will be required to do a mandatory new Colombo Plan training and induction by the NCP Secretariat. We are also down the track looking into embedding this module into the new Colombo Plan, into the pre-departure module for students who go out on a program. And we're working with the new Colombo Plan Secretariat at the moment to start embedding that information into a more formal sort of training, a module for the La Trobe University students. But for now, these two in the induction and training are the main requirements for students and two for staff members. Moving on to Part C, as part of recruitment of students to programs, staff have to complete a working with children check as part of the recruitment policy at La Trobe. So that's one mandatory requirement for staff members. However, for students as well, the working with children check for students involved in programs, particularly offshore programs, would be required going forward. And this can be at their own cost, because obviously the funding that we receive from DFAT as NCP scholarships or any other funding would be benefiting students to help them to bear this cost of working with children check. So it's been embedded that going forward, all students who are going into a offshore the DFAT funded program need to provide us with a working with children check confirmation. We've also linked the working with children check link on there. It's the Victorian government link that we all have to go on and get one from. We'll share this link as we send you through the slides. Moving on to Part 4, Part D, response and investigation. So the key component, managing and identifying and managing risk, assessment of risk. The second really important part is actually that underpins the DFAT policy is the response and investigation part. So sexual harm prevention and response procedure sets out the parameters for the Trobe students in terms of response and investigation of an incident. The collective agreement and the code of conduct sets the parameters for the Trobe staff. For external parties, the parameters which we will follow will be as per the active partnership or the agreement that we have with that partner. And these three categories, these three areas, so the staff, the students, and any external parties would be the ones obviously involved in an incident. And it is the responsibility of all parties to report an incident or in a situation that there is reasonable grounds to suspect any PSEAH or a child abuse incident to La Trobe International. So the reporting procedure is that all incidents are to be reported to the PVCI, Pro-Vice Chancellor International, via that particular email address within the first 24 hours of coming to know an incident. And generally we will keep the privacy as per privacy guidelines that we follow as a university. We will keep the privacy of students and staff and any other parties when we deal with the matter as required. And victims are not obliged to report, but if you are a program leader of sorts, it will be the expectation of DFAT that all incidents are reported as needed. Just one last point on that. Wendy, would you mind going back to part D very quickly? Just for a second. Yeah, so just the last point is that La Trobe University or La Trobe International will then involve any other relevant parties within the university to cover to address any situation in a timely and suitable manner, and bring in any parties within the university to address the situation. Moving on to part E, reporting to DFAT. So this is where the crux of the matter lies. DFAT needs to know every single incident of non-compliancy, of an incident of an alleged incident that had occurred, and they have some parameters in how we need to report those. So at the moment, because this procedure is underpinning a lot of international based programs, the Pro Vice Chancellor International or their appointed delegate is the person who will be responsible for reporting the incident to DFAT from the La Trobe University. So the people who find out, staff members, whistleblowers, or any students or any third parties who find out about an incident, first report it to La Trobe University, La Trobe University International, or PSEAH International, and then we report it in the international unit to DFAT. We follow their procedures and guidelines, etc., to do that reporting. Reporting timeline requirements are very specifically set out by DFAT, and as soon as you become aware of an incident, we have to report it to DFAT in these timelines. So for all child protection notification, child protection matters, abuses or non-compliance, we have to report immediately. And alleged incidents of sexual exploitation, abuse, or harassment, we have 2 working days to report them to DFAT. And any non-compliance with the DFAT, PSEAH, or child protection policies, La Trobe University has 5 days to report it to DFAT. Moving on to the final bit, part F, confidentiality and record keeping. So confidentiality and disclosure will be governed by the La Trobe's privacy personal information policy. And as I mentioned, one part of the reporting process is reporting to DFAT. And in that reporting, we are able to maintain certain amounts of privacy as well. And the second part of it is also managing it within the La Trobe University, particularly if it relates to staff or students. And then obviously the documentation of all the incident matters will also be governed by the records and archives management policy that embeds how we manage all the bits of paper and the information we have. And again, that involves all the parties that may be brought into this conversations, for example, like the student, the Speak Up team, if there is any sexual harassment charges against a student, or the risk management and compliance area, governance area, if there is any staff-based compliance matter. So these are the main underpinning records. There is an example at the very end that we will discuss with you, which was actually an actual incident. I was going to talk about it at this point because it identifies and shows really very well the confidentiality and record keeping and the procedure of reporting, but we'll wait for that to come through, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that in that case study scenario. Now I'm going to hand over the presentation to my colleague, Tim Bendel, to talk a little bit about the risk assessment and the assessment tool that we've developed with the help of the risk management team. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Harshini. Happy to go to the next slide, Wendy. So the risk assessment tool developed by La Trobe, it is aimed to take a risk-based proportional approach to SEAH, and meaning that the higher risk levels will require meeting a higher risk standard through a more significant degree of control measures. It's important when using the tool that the risk assessment tool does assess the risk of the project itself, but then also the risk of all associated downstream partners. So that could be a university overseas, it could be a third-party provider, or any other business or organisation that your program or students may come into contact with. The general aims of the risk assessment tool is to assess the exposure and types of risks that may occur or is likely to occur, or there's some chance during the conduct of that business. The next part is the level of risk. So whether it's a low risk, not likely to happen, or a very high risk in that it's almost going to happen, and part of the control measure is to manage that. And then it'll also help identify which minimum standards apply and what control measures would be needed to meet those. And then the risk assessment tool itself is hosted on the LTI intranet page, but it will look familiar. We've used a version of a risk assessment tool. It's a sort of Excel matrix that would look quite familiar to anyone who has run a overseas program or a similar sort of program that involves students before. It will be quite familiar. Things like drop-down boxes. It will have small explanations of each sort of step. So it will really run you through that bit by bit. And again, that is hosted on the LTI webpage. The tool itself, in terms of the process and the steps involved in completing it and getting one submitted. So the first step is to actually go through the tool, look at each risk category, provide any other relevant information or commentary on the types of activities involved in your program. The second step there is the first stage of a next level of approval. So to find an appropriate supervisor, it might be a head of department, a head of school, or someone else at that sort of level. Now, at this stage, that person isn't responsible for determining the level of SEAH risk or for identifying the minimum standards or anything like that. Their role and in reviewing what you've put in that risk assessment is just to see from an academic point of view or from a program delivery point of view whether that looks accurate and it's a good representation of the program. So that's their level of responsibility. It's not going through the actual SEAH factors. From there, it does need to be submitted to La Trobe Abroad, and this is where the LTI team will look at the risk factors, look at what you put, compare that to the SEAH information provided by DFAT. And if there's any inconsistencies or any questions, then we might also seek advice from the La Trobe University Risk Management Office. Between the two teams, we will identify any issues, any further information we need, any other discussion points that we need to clarify with you. And so we'll provide that advice and feedback back to you directly, and happy to have a discussion, happy to offer any help and advice we can. And then once you've had the chance to address, there may be nothing, it may be acceptable as is, and we can all move on. But if you do need to make any changes, we will give you that opportunity before doing a final assessment with you, just to make sure all those issues were addressed. Happy to go to the next slide. Thanks. For any program that doesn't involve La Trobe Abroad and La Trobe International in terms of setting up a program and delivery, you'll see the first couple of steps there in terms of completing the risk assessment form getting it reviewed by an initial reviewer, be a supervisor or a head of department. Then the next stage is to actually inform La Trobe International. So this is where La Trobe Abroad wouldn't be aware of the situation because it's not something we've helped you with. Because need to be made aware at the earliest possible time that you can complete a risk assessment, and you're aware of the need to do that. Again, we're quite happy to have a discussion with that, but if you've just done the form, then you do need to send it to the Director LTI email inbox. It will be reviewed by the LTI team and perhaps risk, depending on the context of the activity and what sort of activities and whether it's overseas or activity and how DFAT is involved in that. If there's any need for further review of that, you will be advised if there's any changes, if there's any clarification points that need to be made. And then at the end, once everyone's satisfied with the assessment documentation and any other related material to that program delivery, that just needs to be finalised and submitted again to the Director inbox. Happy for the next slide, Wendy? Thanks. And so to talk about a bit more about the risk management tool, so you can see that online on the LTI intranet webpage. But so the questions will sort of revolve around the different types of activities and the context of the program. So it could include information about the activity and also in-country partners and host organisations. So any organisation you may be working with and that would host students. The types of people that students will typically be interacting with, so whether this is professionals in a certain industry or perceived in a position of power, whether they're working with children or other students in the host country, so just a bit more context on who will be involved in the program. Details about the specific location and environment. So often we'll just put a country and a city name, but then this goes a bit deeper to see exactly what sort of environment students will be in, whether there's any risk factors associated with those locations. And then also information about the intended accommodation, so where you will be staying, whether it's hotels, hostels, homestays, other sorts of accommodation that's typical for overseas programs. So just some information about that. Wendy touched on the minimum standards earlier in the presentation. So the risk assessment tool, once all the information has been submitted and the level of risk identified, it will start to suggest which minimum standards will apply. So this could involve various reporting obligations and procedures, and so that those are clearly understood by program leaders, but also our downstream partners. That appropriate PSEAH information is delivered and any training delivered to stakeholders. So this could involve alerting our downstream partners or third-party providers, host organisations, that we have compliance requirements to DFAT as part of this program delivery. And then also prohibiting specific activities and behaviours. So this might be the same as the minimum standards of what we spoke about earlier, but given the program context and the environment you might be going to, there may be other specific activities that would be prohibited in the case of your program. I might leave it there. Thanks, Wendy. Back to you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Harshini. So what we're going to do now is move into some case studies. Now, as mentioned before, this presentation will be sent to you via email. And we have a number of case studies that have been offered here to help provide some context about what this policy and procedure is about. I'm going to skip over the first three cases, and I will leave that to you to review in your own time because I don't think it's a good use of anyone's time for me to read screens to everybody about case studies. But I will skip to the fourth case study that Harshini alluded to as she was speaking. So case study 4, and this is based on a real scenario that the student mobility team worked to find a solution for. So Mark is an Australian student on a study tour. He's in the program with several other students from other Australian institutions. During the program, he develops an intimate relationship with a female participant from another institution, and it's not seen favorably by other students who then start the exchange of rude remarks over social media about the female student. This develops into a situation that runs out of control. The tour leaders are not in a position to manage or curb the social media bullying, and the student experience in the program and emotional and physical safety is clearly compromised. So the answer to the actions that would be applicable to this case study relate to the answer on the screen, and that is that all students are expected to adhere to a set of standards of conduct as per the university student behavior policy during the course of any university-based program, onshore or offshore, as well as uphold the agreements they have made with the university in participating in such a program. Bullying that takes place on virtual modes also falls under the preview of the underlying policies for this procedure. The situation would need to be reported to La Trobe International and then to DFAT. And all students would be investigated and disciplinary action would be brought as per the university-based policies. So in this case, if the student, if it was found that a La Trobe University student was involved in inappropriate behavior, La Trobe University Code of Conduct would apply, and the student would probably be called to a code of conduct hearing, and that process would take over, and then whatever the outcome of that process would be applied. So that's just an example of a real life case study that we've experienced. This was before PSEAH was in place, but clearly would now, PSEAH policy and procedure would apply to this situation.
Wendy, can I quickly interject there very quickly?
Sure.
Now, that particular scenario, La Trobe, it was not a La Trobe University student, unfortunately. None of the students involved were La Trobe University students, but the reason La Trobe was involved in that scenario is because we were the consortium holder of the DFAT funding. So as the consortium holder, funding holder for that funding, we have the responsibility upon us, upon the university, upon the program lead from the Trobe University, as the party to report to DFAT. However, the students who were then for different institutions, they were managed according to those university procedures that they had in place. And we were able to maintain the privacy of those students. When we reported to DFAT, it was reported as an incident, and how the universities are managing the situation and addressing the situation in their own university policies and procedures. However, the conversation about privacy was not compromised. The students were not singled out, students were not reported, as it was just an incident, and how it was managed was what they really wanted to know. So I just wanted to give that context as well, because the conversation about identifying people comes into this conversation. So just wanted to just highlight that.
Okay, thank you, Harshini. So now we're going to move into the question and answer component of the webinar. I can see a number of questions have been submitted through the Q&A button, and I'm going to hand over to Sirat Chankemnarkarn, who is going to facilitate the Q&A question and answer component of this session. Sirat.
Thank you, Wendy. So we have a few questions here. So I will start with the first question, which is from Michael Katumu. So Michael said that his team is conducting a research project funded by DFAT, and it is a collaboration with the overseas organization, which is the Indian Institute of Management. So his understanding is that his team would need to contact La Trobe International, who will assist in managing the PSEAH requirement. Is that correct? Thank you.
Yes, that is correct. And as a part, a risk assessment will need to be undertaken, and that will include the risk assessment of the partner institution in India. So when you receive this, this slide pack, it will direct you to the risk assessment tool that will assist you. And then as per the protocol that Tim went through, you'll need to speak with your head of school or relevant leadership to go through the actual program itself. And once there's satisfied response from the leadership there, it can be submitted into La Trobe International through the director LTI email box, and we will then assist you. Before that, if you have any questions, please do reach out to us, and you can reach out to us through that director LTI email inbox. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Wendy. And while we are on this topic, so I will ask the next question from Quentin Gilmore. So the question is, will the PSEAH risk assessment form part of the quality and standard due diligence process for the agreement?
That is a very good question. I'm going to hand that to Harshini. I believe she's looked into this with the legal office about our agreements.
Yeah. So as part of the overall due diligence assessment, we have had that discussion in embedding a component of a question to confirm that we've actually checked this tick box in relation to any programs that may be run with that particular partner in relation to the NCP funded programs at this point in time. So yes, it is under conversation. Final agreement or arrangement has not been made, but it is the hope is that it will be embedded as part of the due diligence process. And one of the other things that we also wanted to identify is that particularly the partners that we work with in Asia, we know that New Colombo Plan funding is mostly focused on Asia Pacific region. And for partners that we sign up for student mobility programs, be it semester programs or short programs, we could, even though we right now don't have funding, there's option or opportunity to have that funding down the track at any point of time. So the hope is that we do the risk assessment as PSEAH risk assessment as part of the DD process or the due diligence process for all our partners that are likely to be part of a New Colombo Plan or a DFAT funded program funding. In short, that's the answer. So there's a lot of work to be done in that space as we continue to have that conversation with the legal and the quality and standards teams.
Thank you, Harshini.
Thank you. So the next question comes from the colleague and asks, if I am managing a program and become aware of an incident, however, the affected student does not want to report, how do I manage that?
That's a very good question. I could probably answer that, but Harshini, would you like to take that question?
I can answer that, Wendy. So the DFAT process does not require us to identify who the students are. It only requires us to identify a situation and let them know that it's been managed. However, we can't force someone to divulge a situation that they don't want to. So it has to be a in-depth conversation with that person to talk to them about the pros and the cons and the requirements. And as a staff member, if you come to know about something and a possibility of that continuing on even, and if there's some concern that you have for the student, if it's not a matter that has been sorted out and dealt with, there could be some risk of not having that dealt with at that point in time. It could take so many different avenues in that situation. So I would definitely encourage it as to be reported as a person, not identify the actual student as an incident to be reported. But then also, I mean, the Trobe University has policies and procedures in place to help students in situations that are similar to what we've discussed. So I would encourage that student to look at avenues to support them. But again, having said that, it is the discretion of that person. There's certain element of privacy here to be wanting to divulge, particularly if that person is a victim of the situation. Wendy, do you want to add to that?
Sure. So to add to that is, I think the basic gist is, no, we can't force a student to report, but we are required to let DFAT know that something has happened. And as Harshini said, how we're managing it. So in this case, you could foresee that the student says, no, I absolutely do not want this to be, I don't want to make a formal complaint. This is bothering me. As a La Trobe student, we can refer them to speak up for assistance and support. And we would just need to monitor the situation and let DFAT know that we're monitoring the situation. Clearly, if there is no formal complaint, we have to be careful here. We can't make assumptions. We can't take severe action against alleged possibilities without a formal complaint. So then it becomes more about supporting the students, letting DFAT know that the situation has been raised and how we're providing that support. At any time, particularly around student mobility programs, if you're finding this happening, first of all, of course, you do need to let international know as soon as possible, but the La Trobe Abroad Student Mobility Team is there to assist, and they have quite expansive expertise in supporting situations like this. So you're not alone in it. The important thing is that you let us know and we can work together to find out how we will solve this and support the student in question. Sirat, are there any further questions?
That's all the questions that we received so far, Wendy.
Okay. We can stay on for another minute. If anyone has any other questions, we have scheduled this webinar to go for an hour and a half to provide ample opportunity for questions, because this can be quite an intimidating piece of policy and procedure. And the important thing is that everybody understands that as a university community, there is a lot of support to help us ensure compliance and to support each other through difficult situations should they arise. Part of the presentation today was to go through all of the different mechanisms that have been put in place to ensure our compliance and to ensure that our university community is supported appropriately. So are there any other questions? I can see one's possibly popped up there. Sarah?
So the question is from Annabelle Crow. So what is the situation if we are not receiving the funding directly from DFAT, but are subcontracted from a party that is?
I'm happy to answer this, but Harshini or Tim, would you like to answer?
I can give a little bit of what my understanding is in this situation, Wendy. So my understanding in operational matters that we've had so far is that even if you are getting funding from a different party, so a consortium of sorts, and you're part of that project, I would assume, I would consider that we still have to uphold the policies and procedures of the La Trobe University, first of all, and then of DFAT. So compliance is still an important aspect, regardless of whether we have the funding directly or not, because at the end of the day, if something does happen, the other party will have to report it and ensure that we have followed the right protocols and procedures. So I would say, yes, we still have to comply with it, but we don't have the responsibility in terms of actually reporting that incident to DFAT. It'll be the responsibility of the other party who has the funding directly. However, we have the responsibility of managing that situation within the university premises, the policies and guidelines. Wendy, over to you.
Sure. So to add to that, just to provide some further clarification, if we are a partner, it's sort of more of a downstream partner, in this case, that's what it sounds like we are. When DFAT funding is involved, PSEAH applies. The organization that has the funding assigned to them is responsible for the reporting requirements around PSEAH. And as a part of that, any downstream partner should be checked. So if we are affiliated, we should be receiving information from the primary provider. They should be checking us for our PSEAH compliance, in which case you would be able to say, absolutely, we have all of these policies and procedures, there's no problem here, and you could provide links to our website. As Harshini mentioned, if something were to happen, then they would need to investigate that, and we, as the university participating, would need to provide information into that investigation, but we would not be responsible for reporting it directly. It would be the organization that receives the funding directly, it's their responsibility. But it's good, it's a very good question, and it's good for us to be aware of that. And I would go so far as to say, if the organization you're working with has not yet asked you about PSEAH, then you should be proactive and ask them, what is your PSEAH protocol? Would you like to know ours? I can provide that to you.
We also have follow-up question from Annabelle as well, Wendy. So would she need to complete the risk assessment tool and send it to LTI in this situation? And on top of that also, is LTI the first port of call for the university? And will LTI then liaise with the risk office if required?
So let's start with the first question. The risk assessment form should be done because the party that has received the funding should be asking you to do that. So that you can provide evidence to them that you are compliant, us as the university, that we are compliant with PSEAH. So it is in our best interest. I'm not sure if technically we would be in breach if we didn't do that, because we're not the one receiving the funding. We would be a downstream partner in this situation. But it's always best when we're aware of compliance that we need to be proactive and do as much as possible. I don't think you can ever do too much. The risk is doing too little. So in this sense, I would urge you to complete the risk assessment really as a support for the main organization that is responsible for the DFAT funding and ultimately PSEAH reporting. The second question that has been asked, which is about, is LTI the first point of contact? And sorry, Sirat, can you read it again?
Is LTI the first port of call?
Yes.
For the staff, and then LTI will liaise with risk office if required?
LTI is the first port of call if you have questions. But the first port of call is to actually go to the intranet page with the PSEAH information and begin the process of completing the risk assessment. If you're having trouble with that, or if you feel a bit lost, then yes, you can come directly to International. As Tim mentioned, once the risk assessment protocol or tool is completed and it is vetted through your leadership, your head of school or similar, and you submit it to La Trobe International, La Trobe International will take a look. And if we need to seek advice from the risk management office, we will do so. So yes, we would take the lead and seeking advice from risk management. However, I will say, if you feel like you need direct advice from risk management office, I am sure they're happy to hear from you and provide that advice. So you have the choice, but definitely as per the slides today, as Tim had mentioned, we will go to the risk management office if we think we need clarity or further advice.
Wendy, can I just add one more thing to that response very quickly? So if you are doing and you're dealing with an agreement of sorts for a program provider for a university colleague who is leading a program, sort of, I think it'd be important to note to ensure that once the DD form is embedded with this question of confirming that risk assessment has taken into consideration PSEAH risk assessment, it will be important to identify that. And if you're aware that this particular program or provider that you're signing up with has a DFAT funded element or could have a DFAT funding element in the future, it's important to ensure that whoever the initiating party is aware of that from a La Trobe perspective, and to ensure that that tick box is done, and that we ensure from a La Trobe perspective, regardless of whether the funding is with us or funding is through a third party, that we embed that part and check that box before we proceed to make any agreements and arrangements. I thought I'd just throw it out there. I know we mentioned it, but just thought I'll throw it out there.
Thank you, Hashini. So it's really great to see that Annabelle has several questions, and I think it would answer on behalf of other colleagues as well. So there are some specific questions about in terms of the forms. Is there any designated people that should complete the form, the risk assessment tool? And also, is there any training that planned to roll out to other researchers about the SEAH?
So the answer to the first question is the program sponsor. So whoever is writing the grant needs to complete the risk assessment tool or assign a trusted colleague to do that as a part of the grant that's been received. So that's if you've written a grant and received the money, you're responsible for starting the SEAH process to make sure that there is compliance. So again, as a program sponsor or a colleague that you assign as a part of your project, that needs to happen from your immediate work area, and then again be discussed with the leadership that is around you, whether that's a head of school or similar, and then it can be then forwarded to La Trobe International. Again, I'll keep repeating this, and if there's any question, you can always contact La Trobe International for further advice. The second question about rolling out additional training for researchers. This session will be run again on I'm sorry, I can't recall, is it the 20th or the 21st?
20th of July.
The July 20th. This session will run again on July 20th. And we will put out a university announcement to clarify where these recordings will be held, where our colleagues can access them to watch them in their own time. I believe Tim and Harshini mentioned earlier in the presentation that they are looking at further training modules that will be put in place to assist our academic colleagues. And so those may apply, and we will be looking at ensuring that there is a research lens applied to that training. So that's under development. Sarah?
All right, thank you. I think we answered that question. So the question is also whether there is any need for the approver at the school or at the divisional level for the assessment that will be done.
I might turn that over to Tim because I think he specifically talked about that. Yes.
Yeah, there's no designated, other than LTI being the main responsible area for reporting SEAH incidents and managing the procedure. There's no designated sort of approver for the risk assessment tool. It would be most appropriate given the context. So whether it's research, probably we would tend to say a head of department or head of school is probably the best contact to determine if the assessment of that research project or program or whatever is involved is accurate. They may seek input from the research office, and so it may be a collaborative effort on that, but who actually sort of signs that form is not something we'll say has to be some person or the other. It's whoever's most appropriate given the context of the risk assessment tool, what's actually being reviewed. And again, if we have questions, if LTI or the risk assessment, the risk office at the Trobe has sort of a concern or a question, if it's appropriate, if that person or that sort of supervisory line looks appropriate, we'll certainly let you know and have a conversation about that. But I'd say just whoever seems most appropriate given the context.
Thank you, Tim.
No more question from our participants so far, so thank you.
Okay, well, we're at 11 o'clock, and I think this is probably a good place to end the session. I want to thank everybody for your attendance. I can see we've had 26 participants, and it's been, I hope that you have found it helpful. I hope that you will take the time to visit the La Trobe International intranet site and look through the documentation and the risk assessment tool and familiarize yourself with that. As you know, for the new Colombo plan space, the rounds are open now. So I think there will probably be a lot more robust discussion around PSEAH as it relates to the new Colombo plan. And so keep that in mind as you're moving forward and considering writing your applications for the next round of the new Colombo plan. But in the meantime, again, I just want to thank you for your attendance and remind everybody that, you know, when we move into that compliance space, compliance is everybody's responsibility. And I want to acknowledge that those who have attended today clearly understand that, and we appreciate your time and commitment to ensuring that at La Trobe University, we stay compliant and that we are always doing the best for our students and for our university community. So thank you for your attendance. Look out for the email. And if you would like to attend the session again, or if you would like to encourage your colleagues to attend, watch out for the update that should go out through the staff emailing system to let you know when the next session is and also where to find this recording. Thank you for your attendance.